Okay, landed on Sampson now for guided tour of Sampson. First of one of the buildings here, disused now unfortunately.
One of the things, and it's a threatened habitat, most particularly because of the invasive bracken, gorse, bramble, and you can see that creeping up the sides of North Hill. That is the site of medieval settlement, including apparently a chapel, and that's the dedication of the chapel. That's where the islands are named from. There is a covering of silt over those early medieval villages, which shows that the sea has broken through and has come right across this low-lying area of land, and that seems to have happened sometime in the 12th century or so. The islands have been subject to one of the reasons why the defences along the top of Port Cressa have been strengthened to try and give additional protection to Hewtown. But Hewtown and the neck of Sampson are two of the places that are most vulnerable to rising sea levels, and we'll talk a bit more about rising sea levels when we get up onto the top of South Hill and can look down into Eastport. 15th and 16th century, St Martin's had also been abandoned, and the Godolphin family, who were the tenants of the islands, had a very energetic steward in the late 17th century, a man called Thomas Eakins, the man whose initials appear on the day mark on St Martin's if you've been there, and he encouraged resettlement of islands that had been abandoned. The original settlement from the 1660s is on the slope of South Hill. If you look at the hill, you can see there's just about, that's a tamarisk tree. We're going to walk up there to the cottages there. You can pick out the tamarisk tree. The original settlement, the late 17th century settlement, was in that area, close to the well, which we will have a look at. Then, in the 18th century, people settled up on top of the hill. The houses on the skyline there are the next phase of settlement. This cottage was only inhabited for some 20 years or so before the island was abandoned. We'll have a look at the cottage, and then I'll tell you a bit about the deer park and why Sampson became uninhabited. I don't think we're all going to fit in here in one go. You can see this ledge here, which is where the beams would have gone across for the sleeping loft. It's not a very well built structure. It was obviously built by the people who lived in it. You know, they didn't get specialist builders in. The sand dune is pressing on that wall. I don't think it's in danger of coming down any minute now, but it's not a very sensible place to build with sand dunes behind. The walls have no foundations. The bottom course of stones is simply placed on the ground surface, so that again is what makes it a particularly stable structure. Here's the front door, obviously, with a threshold of stone, but it didn't have a paved floor. It would just have a sand floor or a peat earth floor, something like that. There are some paving stones around the fireplace, but the rest of it would just have been soil on the floor. There was a window here. You can see one side of the window, and I think there's a lintel. I think that's sort of standing on either the window. No, that's fine. Just there. So of course, from the top of South Hill, you've got a good view out towards the western coaches. People in the houses there would have been able to signal here. If they saw a sailing ship, they would have been able to get the gig out of the gig shed, launch it into Westport, and row out towards the sailing ships. So there is a benefit in having this house here, but when you think that the well is over there where those people are going at the Apparently they did try to dig some wells and still cut them down. But basically every time you wanted fresh water, you had to walk in there. So that sort of thing. There's a lot of that situation. The other thing that was left else, they ate limpets. They can't run very fast, can they? So you can always be sure of catching limpets. But they do form a very obvious part of the middens, and we've got middens, these domestic rubbish dumps surviving here. The earliest one I know is the one on Nornor, which is Bronze Age in date, about 1600 BC, and this is probably the most recent one from the mid-19th century. And limpets always form quite a large part of what survives in the middens, because the shell is quite dense. You get a lot of shells for not very much meat. This midden was actually excavated by the students from Cardiff University. There were 100,000 limpet shells in it, and that's an accumulation of 20 years in habitation of this cottage. They excavated 90,000. I pity these poor archaeology students who had to count and measure 90,000 limpet shells. And they found other things as well: sheep bones, pig bones, other fish bones, and of course there would have been vegetable matter in there as well. But the limpets are by far the most obvious part of the midden that survives. Stories about why Sampson was abandoned in 1855. One I'm sure you've heard is that the men captured a sailing ship and took it off for salvage. Have you heard this story? Yeah? No? Some of you have?
All the men were lost.
Yes, all the men were lost. They took this sailing ship off for salvage and decided life was better on the mainland and never came back. Or there's also a version of the story that the ship was wrecked. Sometimes you hear that it hit the Wolf's Rock. And generally this is ascribed to the time of the Napoleonic War, so somewhere between 1810 and 1815 perhaps. I have to tell you, there is no documentary evidence whatsoever to support this story. It's a good story, and it seems to come from an incident in the early 19th century on Tresco, when 9 men from Tresco were actually lost in a local boating tragedy. And somehow that recollection of men being lost in a shipwreck of that kind, and Sampson becoming depopulated, the two seem to have got mixed up together, and this is then presented as the explanation for Sampson becoming depopulated. What I think is the more likely explanation is down to the arrival of Augustus Smith in 1834. Now, in the early 19th century, the population of Sampson would have been about 35 or so, mainly 2 families, the Woodcocks and the Webbers. And when Augustus Smith came here in 1834, one of the things he did was to reform the system of land inheritance. That the tradition had been that on the death of the father, the farm was shared between all the sons, and sometimes unmarried daughters, widowed daughters-in-law got a share. This meant that the land holdings were becoming extremely small and really were, getting to below the level where they would provide even subsistence for a family. The population at that time was about 3,000, so now that the resident population is around about 2,000, you see it was considerably larger. Augustus Smith decided that the population was too high here, and he was looking for ways to reduce the population, not just on Sampson but generally across the islands. He reformed the system of land inheritance so that from then on the eldest son inherited everything and the other sons had to find something else to do, and in most cases that was going to be something away from SciLLy. So many of the young men joined the Navy, and the young women were sent into service on the mainland. Now, if you think of Sampson with a population of only 30 odd, that is very soon going to have quite a considerable impact on the size of population here. So the population started to fall from the 1830s onwards as the father of the family died. Then the younger brothers were going to have to move away and find something else to do, because only the eldest brother was going to be able to stay here. So I think Augustus Smith could then see that the population of Sampson was going to become too small to be viable, and he started to formulate his own plans for what he might want to do with Sampson. Of course, he was the complete Victorian country gentleman. What he needed was a deer park, and where better to have a deer park than on Sampson? So I think he also kind of encouraged some of the families to leave. There are certainly records of him sending bailiffs over to evict families from Sampson. But by the mid-1850s, we were down to about half a dozen people living here, and they realised that it wasn't going to be tenable for them to continue living here, and left of their own accord. And Augustus Smith gave up that project, concentrated instead on the emus and ostriches he had on Tresco, and really took no further interest in Sampson. So So Sampson has been uninhabited since 1855, and there is no question of it being resettled now. It's much too precious as a wildlife refuge, but also it's a very important survival of 17th, 18th, 19th century vernacular architecture. Most of the old buildings that survive are the buildings that the gentry and the nobility lived in, aren't they? Here we've got this wonderful resource of the houses that the ordinary people lived in. I mean, it's a bit like St Kilda, and I never understand why Sampson isn't as famous as St Kilda. Okay, it's not quite as remote as St Kilda, but it was abandoned long ago, and it hasn't had the MOD running all over it like St Kilda has. So these are very important survivals of post-medieval cottages. So although we've had rain in the last few days, we've had 8 weeks or so of very little rain, so it's an indication that there is a reasonable supply of water here. It's best when the bracken hasn't grown up round it. But you can see the tamarisk tree there, and there's also gather it's not one of the great works of English literature. If you do ever read it, this is the tamarisk tree, so this is the cottage where
Top here.
these are the second lot of cottages. Like, of course, from here you've got a view out to the western approach. You walk past and climb over the wall, and then we can go in through the front door. When we go in there, I'd ask you to go up to that end. You will see that there is a wooden lintel on this end, which is just about to give way, and I don't want it to give way with anyone standing near it. So we'll go up to the far end of the cottage and perhaps a little bit.
Sorry.
And the parlour at that end with a much smaller fireplace. You see that there. That lady who was in here a moment ago just remarked, one of the strange things about this house is that the front door and the window are both open to the prevailing wind. Well, it's understandable to have a window on this side to look out for the gigs, but why the front door is on this side is a bit of a mystery. I can only assume that they've fallen out with their neighbours over there, and some reason like that why the front door isn't on the other side. Again, this would have had a sleeping loft, and again a thatched roof. And there's a strange little thing there, just behind those two gentlemen. Lots of different interpretations put to that. You know, is it a cupboard? Is it somewhere to put a lantern? Is it where the ladder was placed in order to give access to the sleeping loft? Nobody seems exactly sure what that is. So various experts on post-medieval buildings have applied their expertise to it, and all come up with different explanations when they get stranded. So this kind of little area of stones here, this raised area, is actually nothing to do with the 18th century building. That was done by the filmmakers when they were filming here, and it indicates one of the problems of consolidating buildings. So when this building is made safe, do you take those stones away, or do you leave them there? It's a difficult one. You can see the wooden lintels surviving just about. So that's obviously another bit that needs to be dealt with before it would be possible to have animals here. And in fact, in the past there have been signs up here asking people not to come into this cottage, because it's been like that for a number of years, but at some stage it is going to give way. Hopefully it can be consolidated before that happens. It's one of two places in SciLLy where there's a kind of cemetery of burial chambers. Normally the burial chambers are in ones and twos, but there are a couple of places where there are 8 or 9. One is North Hill over there, and the other is Port Pellet down on St Mary's. Unfortunately, many of the burial chambers on North Hill are in quite a bad state of repair, so we're not missing out on a huge lot by not being able to go up there. And of course, during the Bronze Age, when those burial chambers were constructed, and when this one that I'm standing in and the other two along there were constructed, Sampson wasn't the little island that it is now. It would have been joined across to TRANSCRBE, which would have been joined to
things that are found on a shipwreck from Nelson State.
And is in a tank of fresh water on TRANSCRBE at the moment, the first part of its conservation process, and it will take several more years before it's fully conserved and on display. But it's a unique find. This is the only one of Nelson's ships that survives as the Victory, and that was rebuilt, and so doesn't have all the carving that they originally had on them. So to have this bit of carving surviving from a late 18th century ship is extremely unusual. So it will be nice when it eventually goes on display. It will be either on TRANSCRBE or on St Mary's. I think the discussion is still going on, partly dependent on who's going to pay for the conservation, which is going to cost quite a lot of money. Another one, just where all this vegetation is awarded, burial chambers along this spine here. It's quite an unusual kind of location for burial chambers. It's not usually quite such a rugged place, or such an inaccessible place, but it is very nicely preserved. Likely to have had cremation burials in it. The best of my knowledge, this one was broken into a long time ago. We have no record of what was found in it, but generally it's a small number of cremation burials, perhaps 4 or 6, with the cremated bones either placed inside an urn or placed on the floor of the chamber and an urn upturned over them. And there is an urn from a site on Yew, Obadiah's barrow in the museum. If you go in there, you'll see that, and also some from a site called Lackeyboy on St Martin's. Very little in the way of grave goods occasionally get beans or little bits of pottery, but not very much at all. So you imagine trying to manoeuvre these stones round up here. It's quite some achievement. So I will leave you to have a look at it and take photographs. We'll make our way back to. Are you the last lot?
Yeah, I think so.
To
Yeah.
see it, right? So be back there when you've had a chance to have a look at it.
Looking around this part of the island, over there being St Agnes. South part of the island this is. Right, here's the old broomstick here. Yes, some birds' eggs here. Of course the island is so well overgrown with bracken, it's not easy to get to every part, so I don't have time to go everywhere, so I'm not climbing over those stones either because they're just going to take too long. So I can show you what I can show you. Well, I've had to come back up this hill to get this one on a zoom because there's just so much bracken and overgrowth down there getting to there. I could do it, but the boat leaves at 13:15 GMT and I do not wish to be stranded on the island, at least without my tent. Of course not. So decided to do a zoom in from here instead. Looking down at the northern part of the island. This part is closed off at certain parts for a conservation area, so one cannot get physically to all of the places, unfortunately. Not forgetting the island over here. Right, this is, I think, about the furthest I can probably go on this section of the island across the middle. Virtually reaching the part That is the conservation area. Some of the group there I was with a minute ago. Okay, where I've just been anyway, sweeping round very quickly. Okay, well, centre path through this island on the north side is totally blocked off, so this is just about the best I can get of this side of the island. Right, this really does look as if it's going to have to be the concluding part of Sampson. Do my best under the circumstances. Anyway, I have seen it all from the other islands, I believe. I've just discovered a colony of birds just down here.